It is July 25th, 2026, and last night something happened that has not happened in 2 weeks. Nothing. For 13 consecutive nights, United States Central Command posted the same kind of message to the same account at roughly the same hour. American forces have begun another night of strikes against Iranian military targets. 13 nights in a row, the announcement came. And then, on Friday, as the hours ticked past the window when that post always lands, the account stayed quiet. No announcement, no strike package confirmed, no target list, just silence. Silence after 30 nights of the loudest air campaign the Persian Gulf has seen in a generation. And here is the second number from the last 72 hours that should stop you cold. On July 23rd, exactly one commercial vessel transited the Strait of Hormuz. One. Ship tracking data put it at a single crude carrier named the New Giant, hauling roughly 2 million barrels of Iraqi Basra crude eastward toward the Chinese port of Rizhao. One ship exited, 0 ships entered. That is the lowest single-day traffic count through that waterway since the 7th of May. In a strait that in normal times carries something on the order of a quarter of all the crude oil that moves by sea on this planet, and about a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, the daily tally was one hull, one ship, 13 nights of bombs, and then a night with no bombs at all. If you have been following this war from headline to headline, you have been told 2 competing stories. Washington's story is that Iran has been militarily dismantled, that its leadership was decapitated, that its navy is on the seabed, and that the strait remains open. Tehran's story is that Iran is holding, that the Americans are negotiating with themselves, that the pressure is landing harder on Wall Street than on the Islamic Republic, and that time is on the side of the side that can absorb pain longer. Both stories are being used as weapons. Neither one is the picture. And the reason the 14th night matters more than the previous 13 combined is that it is the first moment in this entire phase of the war where something changed that neither side announced. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building. Within days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was transmitting warnings over marine VHF radio telling vessels that no ship was permitted to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. By the 2nd of March, the IRGC had formalized it, declaring the waterway closed to what it called unfriendly nations and passable only by vessels Tehran itself approved. The Royal Navy publicly noted that the closure carried no legal force, while also acknowledging that legality and safety are 2 different things and that the second one could not be guaranteed. Shipping companies drew the obvious conclusion. Hulls stopped moving. That was the pivot of the entire war, and most coverage still underplays it. Iran had just lost its supreme leader, a large slice of its senior command, and much of its surface fleet. And within 72 hours, it had located the one lever that let a battered regional power put its hand around the throat of the global economy. Not a nuclear weapon. A choke point 2 miles wide at its narrowest shipping lane. The American air campaign scaled with brutal speed. Official operational summaries put the number of targets struck in the first 72 hours at more than 1,700. By the first 10 days, more than 5,000, along with roughly 50 Iranian vessels, damaged or destroyed. The asset list read like an inventory of the entire American strike enterprise. B-2 Spirits against hardened missile and nuclear infrastructure. B-1B Lancers, flying from Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota on missions exceeding 30 hours, each aircraft capable of hauling something in the range of 75,000 pounds of ordnance. B-52 Stratofortresses, long-endurance drones, Patriot and THAAD batteries, stacked across the Gulf to catch what Iran threw back. By the middle of March, Brent crude had breached $100 a barrel. By the 26th of March, a Congressional Research Service assessment recorded 13 American service personnel killed, more than 3,000 fatalities reported on the Iranian side, dead soldiers and civilians in Israel, France, and the Gulf states, and a Pentagon cost briefing to Congress that put the first 6 days of the operation at more than $11.3 billion. That figure, according to the reporting, did not include many of the associated costs. $11.3 billion, 6 days? And that brings us to the part of the timeline almost nobody outside the shipping industry actually understands, because it is the part where Iran stopped merely closing the strait and started monetizing it. Sometime in March, Iranian officials began openly discussing transit fees. An Iranian lawmaker told state broadcasting that collecting $2 million from some vessels crossing the strait was a reflection of Iranian strength. Another lawmaker described parliamentary legislation intended to formally codify Iranian sovereignty, control, and oversight over the Strait of Hormuz while creating a revenue stream from fees, and framed the arrangement as entirely natural. His reasoning was blunt and worth sitting with. Iran provides the security of the waterway. Therefore, ships and tankers should pay Iran for it. That is not a blockade. A blockade is a temporary act of war. That is the construction of an institution. Lloyd's List reporting tracked vessel transits following an IRGC-controlled route rather than the normal internationally recognized lane, and documented the emergence of a body operating under the name Persian Gulf Strait Authority, with per-vessel fees running as high as $2 million, payable in Chinese yuan and Bitcoin, or in dollar-pegged stablecoin. Read that again, payable in yuan, Bitcoin, or Tether. That single detail tells you more about the strategic architecture of this war than a month of press conferences. A regime under comprehensive sanctions, cut off from the dollar clearing system, having lost its supreme leader and most of its navy, built a toll booth on the most important energy corridor in the world and configured it to collect in currencies the United States Treasury cannot freeze. That is not the behavior of a government in its final hours. That is the behavior of a government that has found a revenue model and intends to keep it. Now let's talk about how the first ceasefire died, because the collapse pattern is repeating itself right now in real time. After more than 5 weeks of fighting, on April 7th and 8th, the United States and Iran agreed to a ceasefire that also covered Israel, brokered through Pakistani channels. It was supposed to reopen the strait. It did not. Iran began controlling traffic instead. On April 13th, Washington answered by imposing a naval blockade on Iranian ports, turning away vessels attempting to enter or leave, and cutting hard into Iranian oil revenue. On May 4th, the United States launched a convoy escort operation to walk stranded ships out of the strait. It was paused within about 24 hours. On May 5th, the Secretary of State announced that Operation Epic Fury was concluded, that its objectives had been achieved, and that Washington preferred the path of peace. And on the same day, from the same administration, came the line that revealed what the announcement actually was. Epic Fury would be at an end if Iran delivered what had been agreed. Otherwise, the bombing would resume, and at a higher level of intensity than before. That is not the conclusion of a war. That is a conditional suspension with a public trigger attached. In June, the two sides produced a memorandum of understanding. Its terms are important because they are the terms currently being fought over. The memorandum did not grant Iran sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. What it did was require Iran to use its best efforts to ensure safe, fee-free passage for commercial vessels for a 60-day window between the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman, and to negotiate with Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the strait. Best efforts, 60 days, and a promise to negotiate later about who ultimately administers the waterway. Every ambiguity in that document has since become a shooting position. Iran read the deferred question of administration as an invitation to establish facts on the water before the question was settled. Washington read it as a temporary arrangement that preserved the principle of free navigation. Both readings are defensible from the text. That is precisely why the text failed. On July 6th and 7th, Iranian forces fired on multiple commercial vessels, including 3 in a 2-day span. The American president notified Congress that new military action against Iran had commenced on July 7th under the War Powers Resolution. Within days, the strikes were nightly. Around July 12th, roughly 20 commercial vessels transited the strait in coordination with the American military. An operation nobody officially named, but which looked exactly like the escort mission from May restarted under a quieter label. Several other ships crossed without coordination, some with transponders switched off. On July 13th, the confrontation escalated on 2 axes at once. American strikes hit Iranian oil, gas, petrochemical, and water infrastructure, including a water pumping station in the southwest, where a provincial deputy governor reported 1 killed and 4 wounded. And the American president declared the United States the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, announced the reimposition of the blockade of Iranian ports, and stated that the United States would impose fees at a rate of 20% on all cargo shipped through the waterway. Oil jumped. Equities fell. Then, 1 day later, on July 14th, he reversed the toll. Instead of charging shipping directly, the position became that the United States should be reimbursed for its security effort through investment arrangements with the Gulf states that stand to gain from a reopened strait. The blockade stayed. The fees went away. Sit with the sequence. Iran built a toll booth in the strait and framed it as payment for providing security. Washington condemned it, then briefly announced a larger toll booth in the same strait framed as payment for providing security, then withdrew it inside 24 hours and asked the Gulf monarchies to pay instead. That is not a footnote. That is the central strategic irony of this entire war. And it is the reason Tehran's hardliners believe they have already won the argument even while losing the battle. The moment the United States floated a percentage of cargo fee, it conceded the underlying premise that whoever holds the strait can charge for it. The only remaining question became who holds it. Which brings us to this week, and to the specific detail that changes everything. On July 22nd, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Ali al-Zaidi, flew to Tehran carrying an American ceasefire proposal days after meeting the American president at the White House. This was not a back channel. This was a head of government of a neighboring state acting as courier. In Tehran, he met the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. He met the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. And he met Iran's top negotiator, Brigadier General Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Stop there for 1 second, because that third name is the most undercovered fact in this entire war. Iran's chief negotiator is a brigadier general, not a career diplomat, not the foreign ministry. A general holds the negotiating file. When a state puts a military officer in the chair where a diplomat normally sits, it is telling you something about where authority actually resides and about what kind of settlement it is prepared to sign. Diplomats are rewarded for agreements. Officers are rewarded for positions held. That single personnel decision explains more about why every proposal has failed than any amount of analysis of the proposals themselves. Iran rejected the offer. According to reporting citing Iranian and Iraqi officials, Tehran's objection was not to a specific clause. Tehran's objection was to the category. Iran said it was not interested in a temporary deal that left the question of control over the Strait of Hormuz unresolved. Iranian officials indicated this was the only proposal on the table. The Iranian foreign minister's public framing was sharper still. He said the two capitals already have more than enough mediators, that the problem is not the passing of messages, and he characterized the American approach as illogical, greedy, and controlling. Read that carefully, because it is a rejection of the entire architecture of the diplomacy, not of the offer inside it. Pakistan mediated, Egypt and Turkey drafted. Oman is written into the memorandum. Iraq is now flying proposals in by hand. Iran's answer is that the shuttle diplomacy is not the bottleneck. And then came the part that should be the lead of every broadcast covering this war, and mostly is not. Two Iranian officials told the New York Times that Iran would widen the war if the American president struck Tehran itself or Iranian critical infrastructure. Widening, in their description, meant strikes on Tel Aviv and a push to have the Houthis close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. They named the second choke point out loud, in advance, as a stated escalation option. And then, within days, Iran-aligned Houthi forces attacked Saudi tankers in the Red Sea. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in 2 months. Shipping insurance rates climbed as the market absorbed the reality that both Hormuz and Bab al-Mandeb were now effectively closed to a large share of traffic. Saudi Arabia launched strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen after another Saudi vessel was hit. That is the escalation ladder being climbed exactly as it was described. By the people who described it, days after they described it. It is the clearest signal available that Tehran's threat inventory is not bluff inventory. It is a menu with delivery times attached. Now let's talk about the machinery doing the work on the American side, because the choice of platform in this campaign is itself a message, and the platform doing most of the messaging is older than almost everyone reading this. The B-52 Stratofortress is now in its 8th decade of flight. It first flew when the Korean War was recent history. It is not stealthy, it is not fast, and it does not need to be either, because in a theater where the United States has established air superiority, the only variables that matter are magazine depth, loiter time, and reach. On that scorecard, nothing in the inventory touches it. A single Stratofortress can carry in the neighborhood of 70,000 pounds of mixed ordnance, and photographs from this campaign have shown them departing RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire fully loaded, alongside operations flown from Al Udeid in Qatar. Understand what that basing arrangement communicates. Fairford is in England. An aircraft launching from rural Gloucestershire and delivering ordnance over the Iranian coastline, sustained by aerial refueling on both legs, is a demonstration that the geography of the Persian Gulf offers Iran no sanctuary and that the American strike envelope is bounded by tanker availability rather than by distance. Iran understood the message well enough that it issued warnings to the United Kingdom over permitting the use of the base, and the British government responded that its armed forces were prepared to defend the country against any attack. The weapons employment pattern is a two-step. First, standoff. Long-range cruise missiles released from outside the engagement envelope of surviving Iranian air defenses, which means the bomber never has to enter the threat ring at all. Once those defenses have been suppressed or destroyed, the profile changes completely and the same airframe begins delivering satellite-guided direct attack bombs from overhead, which are dramatically cheaper per target and available in far greater numbers. That is the transition from a suppression campaign to an attrition campaign, and it is why target counts climb so steeply after the first 2 weeks of a modern air war. It is also why the initial figures moved from 1,700 in 3 days to 5,000 in 10. But look closely at what Central Command has said it is actually hitting during these last 13 nights, because the target set has narrowed dramatically from where it started, and the narrowing is the story. Ali Khamenei is dead. He was killed on February 28th, after 37 years as the final authority in the system. On March 8th, the 88-member Assembly of Experts named his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, 56 years old, as the third Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic. Before that appointment, he had spent roughly 18 years in a position within his father's office, described as the Supreme Leader's deputy or gatekeeper, without ever holding a formal executive post. He served briefly in the Revolutionary Guard's ground forces in the late 1980s and held a long association with the Basaj, the paramilitary volunteer force. Analysts across the spectrum describe him as more hardline than his father, with ties to some of the most ideologically uncompromising clerics in the system. He was himself injured in the airstrike that killed his father, and his appointment was followed by a prolonged absence from public view that produced genuine confusion about his condition. Consider what that means operationally. In the middle of the largest war in the history of the Islamic Republic, the office holding final authority over war and peace was transferred to a man who had never run anything publicly, who was physically wounded in the strike that created the vacancy, and who then disappeared from view long enough that outside observers could not confirm his status. It gets worse for Tehran's command coherence. Ali Larijani, the powerful secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, a former Revolutionary Guard general who had taken over crisis management and national security coordination at the start of the year and had become the most visible face of the government after the decapitation strike, was himself assassinated. He was buried in Tehran in mid-March alongside a senior guard officer who commanded Basij forces. The man managing the crisis was killed in the crisis he was managing. Khamenei's own reported shortlist of preferred successors was largely eliminated as well. His chief of staff was reported killed. And in the gap before the succession was resolved, a provisional council of the president, the hardline judiciary chief, and a senior cleric was steering the state. So who is actually in charge today? Nominally, the Supreme Leader. Formally, the president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and a foreign ministry led by Abbas Araghchi. Practically, on the file that matters most, a brigadier general. And beneath all of it sits the institution that is doing the actual fighting. And now also the actual collecting. The Revolutionary Guard runs the Strait. The Guard issues the passage warnings, controls the approved route, boards the vessels, lays the mines, and operates the authority collecting the fees. Which means the Guard is not merely an armed service executing state policy in the Strait. It is a revenue-generating enterprise with its own budget line, its own patronage network, and its own institutional stake in the arrangement continuing. Institutions defend their revenue. That is not ideology. That is organizational behavior, and it is observable in every state on Earth. So here is the honest strategic assessment, stripped of both press offices. Washington's claim that the Strait remains open is technically defensible and practically hollow. One transit in a day is not an open waterway. It is a closed waterway with an exception. At the same time, Tehran's claim to be winning requires ignoring that its supreme leader was killed, dozens of its senior leadership were eliminated, much of its navy is gone, its ports are blockaded, its oil revenue is being strangled, its infrastructure, including water pumping stations, is being struck, and its own citizens are being executed in numbers that human rights organizations have been documenting since the war began, including political prisoners and people detained during the protests that swept the country in January. What both sides are actually doing is competing to be the party that can hold a position while the other party's domestic politics break. And on that measure, the last week produced movement on the American side that Tehran is reading very carefully. The House of Representatives voted for the second time to direct the president to end the war or seek explicit congressional authorization, passing the measure by 214 to 208. The Senate blocked a parallel resolution. That is a divided legislature inching toward a constitutional confrontation over an undeclared war in its fifth month, and every Iranian analyst can read a vote count. Meanwhile, two developments this week reshape the board in ways that will outlast the current strike tempo. The United States signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia that could permit the kingdom to enrich nuclear fuel, reversing long-standing American non-proliferation policy, and the Israeli Prime Minister is due in Washington next week, which brings us back to the silence. For 13 nights, the announcement came. On Friday, it did not. The president said negotiations with Tehran are ongoing and that he believes the Iranians are getting more serious. He also met with senior advisors and cabinet officials the same day to discuss escalation options if the negotiations do not produce a result. And he described the available exits as either a diplomatic deal or simply continuing the military campaign at greater intensity. So the missing 14th night is one of exactly two things, and nobody outside a very small number of rooms knows which. It is either a deliberate, unannounced pause created to give a negotiation oxygen, in which case the last 72 hours represent the closest thing to an off-ramp this war has produced since the memorandum in June. Or it is the operational quiet that precedes a change in the character of the campaign, in which case the target deck is being rewritten right now, and the categories being added are the ones Iranian officials explicitly said would trigger a wider war. Tehran itself, critical infrastructure. And that is the structural risk, the thing that keeps serious analysts awake. and it is not the bombing. It is that there may no longer be anybody in Tehran with both the authority to accept a settlement and the capacity to make it hold on the water. Think it through. A supreme leader appointed in wartime, wounded in the strike that elevated him, with no executive record, and a base that selected him precisely as an act of defiance. A national security coordinator assassinated, a negotiating file held by a general, and an armed service that physically controls the choke point, collects the fees, and would have to voluntarily surrender an institution it built to make any agreement real. Even a supreme leader who genuinely wanted the war to end would have to disband a revenue stream that funds the most powerful organization in the country, in the middle of that organization's finest strategic hour. That is the fragmentation problem, and it is why every proposal has failed in the same way. Pakistan's channel failed, the Egyptian and Turkish 45-day draft failed, the June memorandum was signed and then hollowed out. The Iraqi prime minister flew a proposal in by hand this week and flew home with a refusal. In each case, the refusal came back not as a counteroffer on terms, but as a rejection of temporariness itself, which is the answer a state gives when it cannot deliver what a temporary deal would require it to deliver. And there's a second unresolved variable sitting alongside it. The Houthi escalation into the Bab al-Mandeb was pre-announced as a lever and then partially executed, which means the current fight is no longer bounded by one strait. Two of the world's most important maritime choke points are now contested simultaneously. Insurance markets are repricing both, and the actors operating in the second one do not take orders through the same chain as the actors in the first. An accidental escalation in the Red Sea can now widen a war in the Persian Gulf, and no ceasefire currently under discussion covers both. So we come back to where we started on July 25th, 2026. One ship crossed the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday, carrying 2 million barrels of crude toward China, through a waterway that used to carry a quarter of the world's seaborne oil. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes preceded it. And then, for the first time in 2 weeks, the announcement that had come every single night did not come at all. The Iranian leadership spent the spring convinced that it had found the one lever the United States could not counter, and for a while the evidence supported them. They lost their supreme leader and kept the strait. They lost their navy and kept the strait. They absorbed a blockade, a ceasefire, a formal declaration that the war against them had concluded, and they still kept the strait, and they built a toll booth on it and priced it in a currency Washington cannot touch. But the thing about holding a choke point is that it works right up until the moment the other side stops trying to open it and starts deciding what else it is willing to break. Whether Friday's silence was the sound of a deal being written or a target list being expanded, we will likely know within days. The Israeli Prime Minister lands in Washington next week. The president has already described what the military exit looks like, and he used the phrase heavier dose. Iranian officials have already described what widening looks like, and they used the words Tel Aviv. One ship in the strait, 13 nights of fire, and then one night of nothing at all. Somebody in one of those rooms has already decided what the 14th night means. The rest of us are about to find out. If you want to follow where this goes next, subscribe, because the next 48 hours are going to matter more than the last 4 months.